Bear Creek, Minnesota, in the spring of 1861, was nothing more than a ferry crossing, and 6 wooden buildings huddled against the prairie wind. And Harriet Hartley arrived on a Tuesday to marry a man who was not there. The stage driver had already turned his team before she could ask him to wait. She stood in the mud with her carpet bag and the letter that had brought her here, the one that promised a home and a husband named Thomas Welker. The ferry landing was empty except for a tall man in a dark coat walking toward her from the largest building, which bore a hand-painted sign that said Doctor.
Miss Hartley?
His voice was steady, and his eyes were gray like river stones.
I'm Sterling Lancaster. I was Thomas Welker's physician.
The past tense hit her like a fist.
Was?
He died 3 weeks ago. Fever. Took him fast. I'm sorry you came all this way.
Harriet gripped the handle of her bag tighter. She had sold everything she owned in Ohio to make this journey. The music box her mother had left her was wrapped in a shawl at the bottom of the bag. The only thing of value she still possessed.
Why didn't anyone write to tell me?
I sent a wire to the address he had. It came back undeliverable.
That made sense. She had already left her boarding house when the wire would have arrived. Sterling Lancaster was watching her with a careful expression, the kind doctors wore when they were measuring whether a patient might faint.
I see.
She did not faint. She had survived worse than this. Her father's death, the bankruptcy that followed, the 2 years of stitching quilts by lamplight to save enough for a new start. She would survive this too.
There's a boarding house. Mrs. Pritchard keeps rooms. I can walk you there.
How much does she charge?
$2 a week.
Harriet had $7 left. That gave her 3 weeks to find work or a way home, and there was no home to return to.
All right.
He picked up her bag without asking and started walking. She followed, her boots squelching in the spring mud. The buildings of Bear Creek looked temporary, like they might blow away in the next strong wind. The boarding house was the second structure, 2 stories of rough-cut lumber with a porch that sagged on one side. Sterling set her bag down by the door.
I promised Thomas I'd look after things if anything happened to him. If you need anything while you're here, you can find me at the clinic.
He tipped his hat and walked away before she could ask what he meant by that. Inside, Mrs. Pritchard was a wind-burned woman with sharp eyes who took Harriet's $2 and showed her to a room barely big enough for a bed and a washstand.
Is there work in town?
Harriet asked. Mrs. Pritchard shrugged. The woman said most folks did their own sewing, but the mercantile might need someone to help with inventory when the supply wagons came through. That was twice a month, if the weather held. Harriet thanked her and closed the door. She sat on the narrow bed and opened her bag, pulling out the music box. It was small, made of cherry wood with brass hinges, and when she wound the key, it played a melody her mother had hummed while working. She closed it again without letting it finish. That night she ate bread and cheese from her own supplies and listened to the wind rattle the window frame. In the morning she walked to the mercantile, a long building that served as both store and post office. The owner was a lean man named Cyrus Boone, who looked her over with the expression of someone evaluating livestock. He said he did not need help, but if she could sew harness leather, he might have work in a few weeks. Harriet thanked him and left. She spent the rest of the day walking the town, which took less than an hour. There was the ferry, the mercantile, the boarding house, the doctor's clinic, a blacksmith's forge, and a building that served as both saloon and meeting hall. The nearest neighbors were homesteaders scattered across the prairie, miles apart. By evening, she was back in her room with no prospects and a growing sense that she had made a terrible mistake. The next morning, someone knocked on her door before dawn. It was Mrs. Pritchard. The woman said Sterling Lancaster was asking for her, that there had been an accident at one of the homesteads and he needed an extra pair of hands. Harriet dressed quickly and followed Mrs. Pritchard down to the street where Sterling waited with a horse and a small cart.
A boy cut his leg on a plow blade. His mother can't stop the bleeding, and I need someone to hold the lantern and hand me instruments.
He spoke quickly, already climbing onto the cart. Harriet climbed up beside him.
I've never done that before.
You'll do fine. Just don't faint.
They rode out into the pre-dawn darkness, the cart rattling over ruts in the dirt track. Sterling did not speak, and Harriet did not ask questions. The homestead was a sod house dug into a low hillside with a barn that was mostly canvas and hope. Inside, a woman with flour in her hair was pressing a rag to her son's leg, while the boy, maybe 10 years old, lay pale and silent on a table. Sterling moved fast. He had Harriet hold the lantern close while he cleaned the wound, which was deep and ragged.
Needle.
She handed him the curved needle he had threaded before they arrived. He stitched quickly, his hand steady. The boy whimpered, but did not cry out. When it was finished, Sterling wrapped the leg in clean cloth and gave the mother a small bottle.
Willow bark tea. Twice a day. Keep the wound clean. If it turns red or starts to smell, send for me immediately.
The mother thanked him with tears in her eyes. Sterling refused payment. On the ride back, the sun was rising over the plains, turning the grass gold.
Does that happen often?
Often enough. Out here, a small injury can kill you if it gets infected.
Thomas was lucky to have you.
Not lucky enough.
His voice was flat. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Over the next week, Harriet helped Sterling 3 more times. A child with croup, an old man with a fever, a woman in labor whose baby was turned wrong. Sterling never asked if she was willing. He simply appeared at the boarding house and expected her to follow. And she did, because it was better than sitting in her room counting her remaining dollars. He paid her $1 each time, which she tried to refuse, but he left the money on the table and walked out before she could argue. By the end of the 2nd week, she had almost enough to last another month. She was beginning to think she might survive this. Then Edgar Thorne arrived. He came in a private carriage, which was rare enough in Bear Creek to draw a crowd. He was a handsome man in his 40s with dark hair going silver at the temples and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He wore a fine coat and carried a physician's bag, and when he stepped down from the carriage, he looked at the town like a man surveying property he already owned. Harriet was walking back from the mercantile when she saw him, and something cold moved through her chest. She knew that face. Edgar Thorne had been a doctor in Cincinnati when she lived there, before her father died. He had courted her for 3 months, bringing flowers and speaking of marriage, and when she had refused him, he had spread rumors that she was unstable, that her father's debts were her fault, that she could not be trusted. It had destroyed what little reputation she had left. She had not seen him in 5 years, and now he was here. She turned and walked quickly toward the boarding house, but his voice stopped her. He called her name, Harriet, with the easy familiarity of someone who believed he had a right to her attention. She stopped, but did not turn. Edgar Thorne crossed the street with his boots barely touching the mud. He said it was remarkable to find her here, that he had come to Bear Creek on business and never expected such a pleasant surprise. His voice was smooth, practiced. Harriet forced herself to meet his eyes.
What business?
Edgar smiled. He said Thomas Welker had owed him money, a gambling debt from years before. And now that Thomas was dead, the debt transferred to his estate. He was here to claim what was owed.
Thomas is gone. There is no estate.
Edgar's smile widened. He said there was the land Thomas had filed on, 160 acres by the river, and the cabin he had been building. That would settle the debt nicely. Harriet did not know anything about Thomas's land, but she knew enough to recognize a lie when she heard one.
You'll have to take that up with whoever handles such things here.
Edgar stepped closer. He said he had already spoken with the town council, which consisted of Cyrus Boone and 2 homesteaders who came in twice a month. They had been very cooperative. Then, his voice dropped. He said he had also heard she was working with Sterling Lancaster, and that was a shame, because Sterling was not the kind of man a respectable woman should associate with.
I don't know what you mean.
Edgar leaned in. He said Sterling had a reputation, that there were questions about how some of his patients had died, that a man who made his living from other people's suffering could not be trusted. Then, he straightened and tipped his hat. He said he hoped they would have a chance to speak more soon, and he walked away. Harriet stood in the street, shaking. She did not believe a word Edgar had said about Sterling, but she knew Edgar well enough to know he was dangerous. That evening, she went to Sterling's clinic. He was cleaning instruments when she walked in, and he looked up with that careful expression he always wore.
Edgar Thorne is here.
I know. He came by earlier.
Did he tell you about Thomas's land?
He said Thomas owed him money. It's a lie. Thomas didn't gamble.
I know it's a lie. Edgar is a liar, and worse. He was in Cincinnati when I lived there. He courted me, and when I refused him, he tried to destroy me.
Sterling set down the instrument he was holding.
Why is he really here?
I don't know. But it's not about a debt.
Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to a cabinet and pulled out a ledger. He opened it and showed her a page. It was a survey map, hand-drawn, showing the river and the locations of filed claims. Thomas Welker's name was written on a parcel that bordered the ferry crossing.
The railroad is coming through. They're surveying routes right now. Any land near the ferry crossing will be worth 10 times what it is now. If someone wanted to claim that land before the survey is filed, they'd need to eliminate the original claimant.
Thomas.
And now Edgar is here, saying he has a legal claim.
Can he do that?
If no one challenges him, yes. The town council won't fight him. They're afraid of men like Edgar.
What about you?
I'm just a doctor. I have no legal standing.
Harriet looked at the map. Thomas Welker had been a stranger to her, but he had offered her a future. And Edgar Thorne had taken that from her, just as he had taken everything else. She was tired of running.
There has to be something we can do.
Sterling closed the ledger.
There might be, but it's dangerous.
Tell me.
He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression.
Thomas gave me something before he died. He said if anyone ever came asking about his land, I should use it. I didn't understand what he meant until now.
He went to a locked drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a letter, written in a shaky hand. Sterling gave it to Harriet. She read it quickly. It was a confession. Thomas Welker had witnessed a murder in Kansas 3 years before, and the man who had committed the murder was Edgar Thorne. Thomas had kept silent out of fear, but he had written down what he saw and kept the letter as insurance. If Edgar ever came for him, the letter would go to the law.
This could hang him.
Yes.
Then we give it to the sheriff.
The nearest sheriff is 2 days' ride from here, and Edgar has friends in the territorial government. If we send this letter, it might disappear before it reaches anyone who matters.
Then what do we do?
Sterling folded the letter and put it back in the envelope.
We wait. Edgar will make a move soon. When he does, we'll be ready.
Harriet did not like waiting, but she trusted Sterling's judgment. She went back to the boarding house and lay awake most of the night, listening to the wind. The next day, Edgar Thorne began his campaign. He stood in front of the Mercantile and spoke to anyone who would listen. He said Sterling Lancaster was a dangerous man, that patients had died under his care, that there were questions about his methods. He said Harriet Hartley was a woman of questionable character, that she had come to Bear Creek under false pretenses, that she had been involved in financial scandals back east. He said these things with a smile, in a voice full of concern, and people listened because Edgar Thorne was educated and well-dressed and knew how to make lies sound like truth. By afternoon, Mrs. Pritchard asked Harriet to leave the boarding house. She did it apologetically, but she did it. Harriet packed her bag and walked to Sterling's clinic. He was waiting for her.
You can stay here. There's a room in the back.
That will only make things worse.
I don't care what people think.
She set her bag down.
Why are you helping me?
Because Thomas asked me to, and because it's the right thing to do.
That night, Harriet slept in the back room of the clinic, and Sterling sat up front with a rifle across his lap. Nothing happened, but they both knew Edgar was not finished. The next day, Cyrus Boone came to the clinic with 2 homesteaders. Boone said the town council had met and decided that Sterling should leave Bear Creek. They said his presence was causing unrest, and they could not afford trouble with the railroad coming. Sterling listened without expression.
I'm not leaving.
Boone shifted his weight. He said they could make it official, get the territorial marshal involved. Sterling set down the instrument he had been cleaning.
Go ahead. Bring the marshal. I'll tell him about Edgar Thorne's gambling debts and the people he's cheated from here to Kansas.
Boone's face went red. He said Sterling was making accusations he could not prove. Sterling smiled, and it was not a kind smile.
Try me.
The men left. That afternoon, the sky turned green. Harriet was helping Sterling inventory his supplies when the first hailstones hit the roof. They started small, the size of peas, and within minutes, they were the size of eggs. The noise was deafening. Sterling pulled Harriet away from the window, just as a chunk of ice smashed through the glass.
Get to the back room. Stay away from the windows.
They huddled in the back while the storm raged. Hailstones pounded the roof and walls, and the building shook. It lasted 20 minutes, and when it stopped, the silence was almost worse. Sterling opened the door. Outside, the town looked like a battlefield. Every window was broken. The canvas roof of the blacksmith's forge was in shreds. The crops in the fields were beaten into the mud. People were stumbling out of buildings, checking for injuries. Sterling grabbed his bag,
Stay here.
but Harriet followed him. They went from building to building, checking for injuries. A boy had been hit in the head and needed stitches. A woman had a broken arm from falling debris. An old man was in shock and needed to be kept warm. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, and the town was gathering in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold everyone. Edgar Thorne was already there. He stood at the front of the room, speaking in that smooth voice. He said the storm was a sign that Bear Creek needed leadership, that the town had been too disorganized, too reliant on drifters and outsiders. He said he was willing to stay and help rebuild, to bring in resources and connections. He said the first step was to establish order, and that meant dealing with those who caused trouble. He looked directly at Sterling. Edgar said Sterling Lancaster had been practicing medicine without proper credentials, that he had no legal right to treat patients, that his recklessness had put lives at risk. He said the town deserved better. People were listening. They were tired and scared and looking for someone to blame. Sterling stood in the back of the room, his face unreadable. Harriet could see the doubt spreading through the crowd. Then Cyrus Boone stood up. Boone said maybe Edgar was right, that maybe it was time for a change. Another man agreed. A woman asked what would happen to Sterling. Edgar smiled. He said Sterling would be escorted out of town, peacefully, and that he himself would take over medical duties until a proper physician could be found. It was happening too fast. Harriet stepped forward.
You're a liar.
The room went silent. Edgar turned to her with that cold smile. He said she was understandably upset, that her association with Sterling had clouded her judgment, that she should not embarrass herself further.
You murdered a man in Kansas. Thomas Welker saw it. He wrote it down.
Edgar's smile did not falter, but something flickered in his eyes. He said that was a wild accusation, that she had no proof, that grief and disappointment had made her irrational. Harriet looked at Sterling. He was watching her, and she saw the question in his eyes. She nodded. Sterling reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope.
Thomas gave me this before he died. It's a letter describing what he witnessed. Edgar Thorne killed a man named Samuel Rigby over a card game in Leavenworth, Kansas in 1858. Thomas saw it happen.
Edgar's face went pale. He said it was a lie, that Thomas was a drunk and a liar, that the letter was forged. Sterling opened the envelope and began to read. Thomas's handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. He described the night in detail, the argument over cards, the knife Edgar had pulled, the way Samuel Rigby had fallen. He described how Edgar had paid off the town marshal and left before dawn. He described the guilt he had carried for staying silent. When Sterling finished, the room was silent. Then one of the homesteaders stood. The man said he had been through Leavenworth in 1858, that he remembered hearing about a man named Rigby, who had been killed. Another man said he had known Samuel Rigby, that Rigby had been a good man with a family. Edgar backed toward the door. He said they had no right to judge him, that the letter proved nothing, that he would bring the law down on all of them. But the door was blocked. Two men stepped in front of it. Edgar's hand went to his coat pocket, and Harriet saw the shape of a pistol.
Don't.
But Edgar was not listening. He was watching the crowd with wild eyes, and Harriet could see the paranoia taking over. He pulled the pistol and aimed it at Sterling. Harriet moved without thinking. She stepped between them.
If you shoot him, they'll hang you tonight.
Edgar's hand was shaking. He said she had ruined everything. That she should have married him when she had the chance. That none of this would have happened if she had just done what she was supposed to.
I was never supposed to belong to you.
For a moment, she thought he would pull the trigger. Then Cyrus Boone hit Edgar from behind with a chair. The pistol went off, the shot going wide, and Edgar went down. Two men grabbed him and pinned his arms. Sterling kicked the pistol away. Edgar was screaming now, saying they had no right, that he would see them all destroyed. One of the homesteaders said they should send for the marshal. Another said they should lock Edgar in the root cellar until the marshal arrived. Boone said they would do both. They dragged Edgar out, still screaming. The room emptied slowly, people drifting back to their homes to assess the damage from the storm. Sterling and Harriet stood alone in the saloon.
You stepped in front of a gun.
So did you. Every time you treat a patient.
That's different.
No. It's not.
He looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real.
Thomas told me to look after you. I thought he meant find you a place to stay, maybe help you get home. I didn't know he meant this.
What did he tell you? Exactly.
He said there was a woman coming who deserved better than what life had given her. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure she got that better life. He made me promise.
Why would he do that? He didn't know me.
I think he knew enough. He was a good judge of character.
Harriet felt something break open in her chest. Something that had been closed for a long time.
I sold everything I had to come here. I have a music box and $7 and no home to go back to. That's not much of a life.
It's more than you think.
He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and steady.
Stay.
Here?
Here. With me. We'll rebuild. The town needs a doctor, and I need someone who's not afraid to step in front of a gun.
She laughed, and it felt strange after so much fear.
That's not much of a proposal.
I'm a doctor, not a poet.
But his eyes were serious, and Harriet could see what he was offering. Not just safety, not just a home, but a partnership. A life built on something real.
I don't know anything about medicine.
You'll learn. And I'll teach you to shoot, so next time you don't have to step in front of the gun.
Next time?
This is the frontier. There's always a next time.
She squeezed his hand.
All right. I'll stay.
They walked out into the night. The storm had cleared, and the stars were sharp and bright. The town was quiet, except for the sound of people repairing roofs and sweeping up glass. Sterling walked her back to the clinic, and they stood outside the door.
I promised Thomas I'd look after you. I didn't promise I'd fall in love with you. That just happened.
Harriet's breath caught.
When?
The first time you handed me a needle without flinching. Maybe before that.
She reached up and touched his face.
I came here looking for a husband. I found something better.
What's that?
A reason to stay.
He kissed her then, and it was gentle and sure, and Harriet felt the last of her fear fall away. When they pulled apart, Sterling was smiling again.
We should probably make this official.
Probably.
How about next week? There's a circuit preacher who comes through on Thursdays.
Next week?
Unless you want to wait.
I've waited long enough.
They went inside together, and Sterling lit a lamp. The clinic was small and drafty, but it was warm, and it was theirs. Over the next few days, the town began to rebuild. The hailstorm had destroyed the crops, but the people were stubborn. They replanted. They repaired. The territorial marshal arrived and took Edgar Thorne away in chains. He would stand trial for Samuel Rigby's murder, and the law would finally catch up to him. Harriet helped Sterling with his patience, and she learned quickly. She had steady hands and a calm voice, and people began to trust her. On Thursday evening, the circuit preacher arrived, a thin man with kind eyes who asked no questions. Sterling and Harriet stood in front of the clinic under the lanterns, and the preacher spoke the words that made them husband and wife. Mrs. Pritchard brought a cake. Cyrus Boone brought a bottle of whiskey. The homesteaders brought their families, and for a few hours Bear Creek felt like a real town, not just a collection of strangers waiting for something better. When the crowd left, Sterling and Harriet stood alone in the lamplight. He held her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder.
I kept my promise to Thomas.
You did more than that.
What do you mean?
You gave me a life worth living.
He kissed the top of her head,
We'll build it together.
and they did. The railroad came through 2 years later, and the land Thomas Welker had filed on became valuable, just as Sterling had predicted. But by then, it did not matter. Sterling and Harriet had built a life that was not measured in land or money, but in the people they helped and the home they made. The music box sat on a shelf in their cabin, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, Harriet would wind it and let it play. The melody reminded her of her mother, and of the journey that had brought her to Bear Creek, and of the man who had promised to look after her, and had kept that promise in ways neither of them had expected. They stood together beside the corral under the lantern light, and the future stretched out before them, full of work and hope and love. It was not the life Harriet had imagined when she answered that newspaper ad, but it was better. It was real. And it was theirs. The weeks that followed were filled with the rhythm of frontier life. Sterling taught Harriet how to clean wounds properly, how to recognize infection before it spread, how to set a broken bone so it would heal straight. She learned the smell of carbolic acid and the feel of silk thread sliding through flesh. She learned when to be gentle and when to be firm, when a patient needed reassurance and when they needed the truth. The town grew slowly. New families arrived, drawn by the promise of railroad money and cheap land. A general store opened, then a blacksmith shop. Mrs. Pritchard started a boarding house. Cyrus Boone became the unofficial mayor, and though he still drank too much, he kept the peace. One morning in late autumn, a wagon rolled into town carrying a family that had been attacked on the trail. The father had been shot in the shoulder, and the wound had festered. Sterling worked for 3 hours to remove the bullet and clean out the infection, while Harriet kept the man's wife calm and his children occupied. When it was over, Sterling was exhausted, but the man would live. The wife tried to pay with a quilt she had made, and Harriet accepted it gratefully. That night, she and Sterling lay beneath the quilt in their cabin, and she traced the patterns with her fingers.
She put months of work into this.
People pay what they can.
It's beautiful.
So are you.
She turned to look at him in the darkness.
You're supposed to be the practical one.
I can be practical and honest at the same time.
She kissed him, and for a while there was no talk of quilts or payments or the hard work that waited for them in the morning. In December, a letter arrived from Kansas. Edgar Thorne had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. The trial had uncovered other crimes, other deaths, other lies. The morphine habit had destroyed him long before the law caught up. Harriet read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it away. She felt no triumph, only a quiet relief that it was finished. Sterling asked if she wanted to talk about it, and she said no. They had built something new, and she did not want to drag the past into it. Christmas came, and the town held a dance in the saloon. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the music was loud and joyful. Sterling was not a natural dancer, but he tried, and Harriet laughed as he stepped on her toes.
I'm better with a scalpel.
You're perfect with everything else.
They danced until the candles burned low and the children fell asleep in their mother's arms. Walking home under the stars, Harriet felt a contentment she had never known before. The cold was sharp, but Sterling's arm was warm around her shoulders.
I never thanked you.
For what?
For keeping your promise to Thomas.
I told you, that promise turned into something else.
I know. But still. Thank you.
He stopped and turned to face her, his breath misting in the cold air.
I'm the one who should be thanking you. You could have gone back east. You could have found safety somewhere else. But you stayed.
I stayed because you gave me a reason to.
We gave each other reasons.
They stood in the middle of the frozen road, holding each other close. And Harriet knew that this was what she had been searching for when she answered that newspaper ad. Not a husband, not security, but a partner. Someone who saw her as she was and chose her anyway. In January, a blizzard hit and trapped the town for 3 days. Sterling delivered a baby in the middle of the storm, with Harriet assisting. The mother was frightened and the labor was hard, but the baby came out screaming and healthy. When it was over, the father shook Sterling's hand and then Harriet's, his eyes wet with tears. He said they would name the baby Harriet if it was a girl, and they had. Walking back through the snow, Sterling took her hand.
You did well in there.
I just did what you told me.
No. You knew what to do before I said it. You have a gift for this.
I'm still learning.
So am I. We all are.
That winter was long and brutal, but they survived it together. When spring came, the snow melted and the rivers swelled, and the ferry began running again. New travelers arrived, some heading west to the gold fields, others looking for land to settle. The town grew, and so did Sterling's practice. He taught Harriet how to deliver a baby on her own, how to recognize the signs of cholera and diphtheria, how to comfort the dying. She learned to trust her instincts and to ask for help when she needed it. One evening in April, a young woman arrived at the clinic alone. She was bruised and bleeding, and she would not say who had hurt her. Harriet cleaned her wounds and gave her a place to sleep while Sterling went to find Cyrus Boone. They decided the woman could stay at Mrs. Pritchard's boarding house until she felt safe enough to move on. The woman thanked Harriet with tears in her eyes, and Harriet thought of her own arrival in Bear Creek, frightened and alone, and how much had changed. In May, the railroad survey team arrived. They spent 2 weeks mapping the land and marking the route. The line would run through the northern edge of town. just as everyone had hoped. Property values rose overnight. And suddenly, Bear Creek was full of speculators and investors. Sterling refused to sell Thomas Welker's land.
He filed that claim for a reason. We'll hold on to it.
For how long?
As long as it takes. Maybe we'll build a hospital on it someday.
Harriet liked that idea. A real hospital with beds and equipment and room for patients who needed more than a quick visit to the clinic. It was a dream, but dreams had a way of coming true in Bear Creek. The summer was hot and dry, and the crops struggled. But the town was stronger now, more organized. People shared water and resources, and no one went hungry. Sterling and Harriet worked from dawn until dark, treating heat stroke and dehydration and the occasional injury from farm work. One afternoon, a rider came in from the south, his horse lathered and exhausted. He said there was a family stranded 20 miles out, their wagon broken, and the father bitten by a rattlesnake. Sterling grabbed his bag and his horse, but Harriet stopped him.
I'm coming with you.
It's a hard ride.
I can handle it.
He did not argue. They rode out together, and Harriet felt the sun beat down on her shoulders and the wind whip through her hair. When they reached the stranded family, the father was in bad shape. The bite had swollen his leg to twice its size, and fever had set in. Sterling cut open the wound and drained the venom while Harriet held the man down and his wife sobbed. It took hours, but the swelling went down and the fever broke. They stayed with the family until dark, then helped them repair the wagon wheel. Riding back under the stars, Harriet felt exhausted but proud.
You saved his life as much as I did.
We saved his life together.
That's what I like about you. You don't need credit. You just do the work.
I learned that from you.
He smiled at her in the moonlight, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. When they reached home, they collapsed into bed and slept until noon the next day. By the end of summer, Harriet realized she was pregnant. She told Sterling one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun go down. He did not say anything for a long time, just held her hand and stared at the horizon.
Are you all right?
I'm terrified.
So am I.
I've delivered dozens of babies. I know everything that can go wrong.
Then, you'll know how to make sure nothing does.
He turned to look at her, his eyes serious.
I won't let anything happen to you.
I know.
They sat together in the fading light, and Harriet felt the future take shape around them. A child. A family. A life built on love and work, and the kind of trust that only came from facing danger together. In September, a fire broke out in the general store. It spread quickly, and within minutes half the town was ablaze. Sterling and Harriet joined the bucket brigade, passing water from the river until their hands were raw and their lungs burned from smoke. The fire was finally contained, but 3 buildings were destroyed and a dozen people were left homeless. That night, the town gathered in what was left of the saloon. Cyrus Boone stood up and said they would rebuild, stronger than before. People nodded and agreed. Bear Creek had survived hailstorms and blizzards and villains. It would survive fire, too. Harriet and Sterling offered their cabin to 2 families who had lost everything, and they slept in the clinic for a week until temporary shelters could be built. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but no one complained. They were alive, and they were together, and that was enough. By October, the town was rebuilt and life returned to normal. Harriet's pregnancy began to show, and people congratulated them wherever they went. Mrs. Pritchard knitted tiny blankets and booties. The homesteaders built a cradle. Sterling fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less. She ignored him most of the time, but she loved him for trying. One cold morning in November, a stranger rode into town. He was well-dressed and carried official-looking papers. He asked for Sterling Lancaster, and when Sterling came out of the clinic, the man introduced himself as a representative of the territorial government. He said the governor had heard about Sterling's work in Bear Creek and wanted to offer him a position as the regional medical officer, overseeing health care for all the settlements in the Northern Territory. It would mean more money, more resources, and the authority to establish hospitals and train other doctors. Sterling listened carefully, then thanked the man and said he needed time to think. When the stranger left, Harriet asked what he was going to do.
What do you think I should do?
I think you should do what makes you happy.
You make me happy. This town makes me happy. I don't need a title or authority.
But you could help more people.
I can help people right here.
She put her hand on his arm.
You already are.
He smiled and kissed her forehead.
Then that's my answer.
The next day, he sent a letter declining the offer. The territorial representative returned one more time to try to change his mind, but Sterling was firm. Bear Creek was his home, and he was not leaving. That evening, Harriet played the music box, and they sat together listening to the familiar melody.
Do you ever regret staying here?
Never. Do you?
Not for a second.
In December, the first snow fell, soft and quiet. Harriet stood at the window of the clinic, watching the flakes drift down, and felt the baby move inside her. She called Sterling over, and he placed his hand on her belly, his face filled with wonder.
Strong kick.
Takes after you.
Or you.
They laughed together, and Harriet thought about how far they had come since that first morning when she arrived at the ferry crossing looking for a man she had never met. Thomas Welker's promise had brought them together, but their own choices had kept them together. That was the difference between obligation and love. Christmas came again, and this time the town held the dance in a newly built community hall. The fiddle player had been joined by a banjo player and a harmonica player, and the music was even louder than before. Harriet could not dance as much because of the baby, but Sterling stayed close to her side, bringing her cider and making sure she had a chair when she needed to rest. As midnight approached, people began to leave, bundling up against the cold and heading home. Sterling helped Harriet into her coat, and they walked slowly back to the cabin. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath hung in the air.
Next Christmas, we'll have a baby.
I know.
Are you ready?
No. But I will be.
Me too.
They reached the cabin and went inside. Sterling built up the fire while Harriet settled into the rocking chair he had made for her. She put her hands on her belly and felt the baby shift.
Do you think it's a boy or a girl?
Doesn't matter to me.
Me neither. As long as it's healthy.
It will be. I'll make sure of it.
She smiled at his certainty. He had delivered so many babies, saved so many lives, but this one would be different. This one would be theirs. In January, A thaw came early, and the river broke up with a roar that shook the ground. Ice floes jammed against the ferry dock, and for 3 days the crossing was impassable. Then the weather turned cold again, and the river froze solid, smooth as glass. Children skated on it, and men cut blocks of ice to store for summer. Sterling warned everyone to stay away from the weak spots near the banks, and miraculously, no one fell through. By February, Harriet was tired all the time. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and she could not sleep through the night. Sterling did his best to help, rubbing her back and making her tea. But there was only so much he could do. Mrs. Pritchard came by with advice and more knitted items, and the other women in town took turns bringing meals and keeping her company. Harriet had never had sisters, but now she felt like she did. One afternoon, a young couple came to the clinic. They had just arrived in town and were looking for a place to settle. The woman was pregnant too, further along than Harriet, and she looked exhausted. Sterling examined her and said the baby was in a breech position. He would need to turn it before she went into labor, or the delivery would be dangerous. The woman was frightened, but Sterling's calm voice reassured her.
I've done this before. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it will save your baby's life.
He worked carefully, his hands firm and gentle, and after 20 minutes, the baby shifted into the correct position. The woman cried with relief, and her husband shook Sterling's hand over and over. He said they had heard about the doctor in Bear Creek who never gave up on his patients, and they had come here hoping for help. Harriet felt a swell of pride. This was what they had built together. A place where people could come for help and know they would not be turned away. In March, the young woman went into labor. Sterling delivered the baby at dawn, with Harriet assisting. It was a girl, healthy and loud, and the parents named her Hope. Harriet held the baby for a moment before handing her back to her mother, and she felt tears on her cheeks.
You all right?
Yes. Just thinking about ours.
Soon.
2 weeks later, Harriet's labor began. It started in the middle of the night, a tightening across her belly that woke her from sleep. She lay still for a moment, counting the time between contractions, then reached over and shook Sterling awake.
It's time.
He was on his feet instantly, lighting the lamp and gathering supplies. He had prepared for this moment for months, but now that it was here, his hands shook. Harriet saw it and took his hand.
You can do this.
I know. I just wish someone else was doing it.
There's no one else I trust.
He nodded and took a deep breath, and the shaking stopped. He was a doctor again, calm and focused. The labor was long and hard. Harriet had helped deliver enough babies to know that, but knowing did not make it easier. The pain came in waves, each one stronger than the last, and she gripped Sterling's hand until her knuckles turned white. He stayed with her the whole time, murmuring encouragement, checking her progress, wiping the sweat from her forehead.
You're doing great. Not much longer.
You said that an hour ago.
And I was right. You're almost there.
Finally, as the sun rose over Bear Creek, the baby came. Sterling caught it in his hands and held it up, and Harriet heard a cry that filled the room.
It's a boy.
He placed the baby on her chest, and Harriet looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature and felt something break open inside her.
He's perfect.
He is.
Sterling cut the cord and cleaned the baby, then wrapped him in one of Mrs. Pritchard's blankets. Harriet held her son and felt tears stream down her face. She had come to Bear Creek looking for safety and found so much more. A home, a partner, a family. Sterling sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, and they looked at their son together.
What should we name him?
Thomas. After the man who brought us together.
Thomas Lancaster. I like it.
The baby yawned and closed his eyes, and Harriet felt a peace settle over her. Outside, the town was waking up. She could hear the ferry bell ringing, the sound of wagons on the road, the voices of people starting their day. Bear Creek was alive and growing, and they were part of it. Over the next few weeks, the town came to visit. Mrs. Pritchard brought more blankets. Cyrus Boone brought a hand-carved rattle. The homesteaders brought food and firewood. Everyone wanted to see the baby, and Harriet welcomed them all. She was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. Sterling helped with everything, changing the baby, rocking him to sleep, staying up through the long nights when Thomas cried. He was as dedicated to fatherhood as he was to medicine, and Harriet loved him even more for it. One evening in April, they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset. Thomas was asleep in Harriet's arms, and the air was warm with the smell of spring.
I was thinking about something.
What?
We never had a real wedding.
We had a wedding.
We had a ceremony during a hailstorm with half the town as witnesses. I want something more.
Like what?
I don't know. Something simple. Just us. And the people we care about.
We can do that. When?
Soon. Before summer.
All right. I'll talk to Reverend Miller.
They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Harriet felt the baby's weight in her arms and Sterling's presence beside her, and she knew this was what happiness felt like. Not perfect, not without struggle, but real. A week later, they stood beside the corral under lantern light. The sun had just set, and the sky was still glowing with the last traces of day. Reverend Miller stood before them, holding his Bible, and around them were gathered the people of Bear Creek. Mrs. Pritchard, Cyrus Boone, the homesteaders, the young couple with baby Hope, and dozens of others. Harriet wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Sterling wore his best coat. Thomas slept in Mrs. Pritchard's arms, wrapped in blankets. Reverend Miller spoke about love and commitment, and the promises people make to each other. Harriet barely heard the words. She was looking at Sterling, at the man who had kept a promise to a dying friend, and found something neither of them expected. He was looking at her the same way, his eyes steady and full of emotion. The Reverend asked if they would take each other, and they both said yes.
I will.
I will.
There were no rings, no elaborate vows, just two people choosing each other, again in front of everyone who mattered. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Sterling leaned down and kissed her, and the crowd cheered. Lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, and someone started playing a fiddle. People clapped and danced, and Harriet felt Sterling's hand in hers, warm and strong.
We did it.
We did.
What now?
Now. We live.
She smiled and pulled him close, and they danced under the lanterns while the stars came out one by one. The music played on, and the people of Bear Creek celebrated with them. Harriet looked around at the faces, at the town she had come to love, and she knew that this was where she belonged. Not because a newspaper ad had brought her here, and not because a promise had been made, but because she had chosen it. She had chosen him. And he had chosen her. Cinematic late 1800s American West photograph. Natural light, gentle contrast, slightly soft focus, subtle film grain, faint dust/scratches, slight vignetting, no text, no watermark. Beside a wooden corral at twilight, lanterns glowing warmly. A young man in his 30s in dark formal coat, and a young woman in her 30s with chestnut brown hair and simple wedding dress hold hands and smile at each other. Townspeople gathered around them in celebration. Fiddle player visible, stars beginning to appear in deepening blue sky, joyful wedding atmosphere. The dancing went on until the lanterns burned low, and the children fell asleep in their mother's arms. Sterling and Harriet stayed until the last guest left, then walked back to the cabin together. Mrs. Pritchard had already taken Thomas home and put him to bed, and when they arrived, she was sitting in the rocking chair, humming softly. She looked up and smiled. Mrs. Pritchard said the baby had been perfect, not a single cry, and she was heading home now. Harriet thanked her and walked her to the door, then closed it behind her. The cabin was quiet. Sterling hung his coat on the peg and turned to look at Harriet.
Mrs. Lancaster.
I like the sound of that.
So do I.
He crossed the room and took her hands in his.
I meant what I said. We're going to live. No more running. No more hiding. Just us.
Just us.
They checked on Thomas, who was sleeping soundly in his cradle, then went to bed. Harriet lay in Sterling's arms and listened to the sound of his breathing, steady and calm. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The newspaper ad, the ferry crossing, the missing groom, the hailstorm, Edgar Thorne and his lies, the music box, the trial. All of it had led to this moment, and she would not change a single thing. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of the river. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered. The sounds of the frontier, familiar and constant. Harriet closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but also knowing that she would not face them alone. Sterling stirred beside her and tightened his arm around her waist.
You awake?
Barely.
I love you.
I love you too.
And that was all that needed to be said. The next morning, they woke to the sound of Thomas crying for his breakfast. Harriet fed him while Sterling made coffee, and they sat together at the table, passing the baby back and forth, learning the rhythm of their new life. There would be hard days ahead. There would be illness and injury, loss and disappointment. But there would also be moments like this. Quiet mornings with coffee and sunlight. The warmth of family. The knowledge that they had chosen each other and would keep choosing each other every single day. Bear Creek continued to grow. More settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. The town built a school, then a church, then a general store that sold goods shipped in from St. Paul. The ferry crossing became a hub, a place where people stopped to rest and resupply before continuing their journey west. Sterling's clinic stayed busy. He treated broken bones and fevers, delivered babies and set dislocations, and never turned anyone away. Harriet worked beside him when she could. And when she could not, she stayed home with Thomas, sewing quilts and tending the garden. The music box sat on the shelf, silent now, its work done. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, Harriet would wind it up and let the melody play, and she would remember the mother she had lost and the life she had found. Sterling would come and sit beside her, and they would listen together, holding hands in the lamplight. Years would pass, and Thomas would grow, and other children would come. The town would change, and they would change with it. But the foundation they had built on that first day, when Harriet stepped off the ferry and Sterling kept his promise, would hold. It would hold through storms and droughts, through sickness and health, through every challenge the frontier could throw at them, because they had chosen love over fear, and truth over lies, and each other over everything else. And that was enough. One afternoon in late summer, when Thomas was learning to walk and the garden was full of tomatoes and squash, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Sterling, and the return address was from a hospital in St. Paul. Harriet watched as he opened it, his expression unreadable.
What is it?
Sterling read the letter twice before speaking.
It's from the medical board. They're offering me a position. Head surgeon at the new hospital.
In St. Paul?
Yes.
Harriet felt her stomach tighten. St. Paul was a city, with paved streets and gas lamps, and opportunities Sterling could never have in Bear Creek. It was everything a doctor could want.
Do you want to go?
No.
Are you sure?
I'm sure. I made a promise here. To Tom. To you. To this town. I'm not leaving.
He folded the letter and set it aside, then crossed the room and took her hands.
This is home. You and Thomas. Bear Creek. This is where I belong.
But what if you regret it?
I won't.
Harriet searched his face and saw no doubt, only certainty. She leaned into him and felt his arms close around her.
Then, we stay.
We stay.
Sterling wrote back that same evening, thanking the hospital but declining the offer. He sealed the letter and left it on the table for the morning mail coach. That night, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. And Harriet felt the peace of knowing they had made the right choice. Not the easiest choice, but the right one. The town needed them, and they needed the town. That was enough. Thomas took his first steps a week later, stumbling from Harriet's arms into Sterling's, and they both cheered. The baby laughed and clapped his hands, delighted by the noise. Over the next few months, he grew bolder, toddling around the cabin and getting into everything. Sterling built a small fence around the garden to keep him out of the vegetables, and Harriet sewed him new clothes as he outgrew the old ones. The seasons turned. Autumn brought cooler air and the harvest. Winter brought snow that blanketed the town and turned the river to ice. Spring brought mud and new growth, and summer brought heat and the smell of wildflowers. Through it all, Sterling and Harriet worked side by side, raising their son and caring for their neighbors. They had arguments, as all couples do, and sleepless nights, and moments of frustration. But they also had laughter and quiet evenings, and the knowledge that they were building something that would last. One evening in the second summer, as they sat on the porch watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard, Sterling reached over and took Harriet's hand.
I've been thinking
About what?
about how lucky I am.
Lucky?
I could have lost you. That day in the storm, when Edgar had you arrested, I could have lost everything.
But you didn't.
Because you trusted me. Because you fought.
Because you kept your promise.
I'd do it again. Every time.
Harriet squeezed his hand and smiled.
I know.
They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play, and Harriet felt the weight of all they had survived and all they had built. This was the life she had come looking for when she answered that newspaper ad. Not the one she had imagined, but something better, something real. And as the sun set over Bear Creek and the fireflies danced in the twilight, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.